Hi, everybody. It's time to start up our intellectual side of our work. This is the in-person part of the program. We had to give deference to our speakers from Israel and Morocco to make sure. Menachem Kellner wrote me at a certain point that he was going to bed, and I can understand that. But we see that some of these Israelis are still there on Zoom, and we give them credit for their courage. We're going to have Professor Ken Seeskin from Emeritus from Northwestern, and he will be introduced by my highly valued colleague, Emma Costa, who is a world-class Spinoza scholar and has been kind enough to chair this session.
It's a great pleasure to be here to celebrate Len Guzman's incredible achievement with this double publication. But right now, I'm here to introduce Ken Seeskin, who's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Emeritus Professor of Jewish Civilization from Northwestern, where he's taught for many, many years and contributed incredibly to the development of the field, in particular on Maimonides. He was the editor of the Cambridge Handbook of Maimonides. He published an incredible research project on Maimonides on the origin of the word, and of course, thinking about a distant God. So it is my great pleasure to introduce him today, as he will speak about Maimonides between occasionalism and determinism. Thank you.
Want the microphone or do you?
I always was told Jews don't need a microphone.
Okay.
Whenever I comment in public on Len's work, which I've learned much from, there's always, I say one thing that I will never forgive him for. And that's the time when it was 30 below in Chicago. And I walked into my house and the phone rang. And it was Len. And the first thing he said was, "Hi, Ken, a warm hello from Hawaii." Could have killed him. All right, anyway. I want to begin with high praise for what Len and Philip have accomplished. Although the literature on Maimonides has grown by leaps and bounds over the past 25 years, I think they've set a new standard for clarity, fluency, and reliability. My big regret in having retired is that I cannot assign it to my students anymore, right? Because I don't have any. I also want to praise them for parting company with Strauss and esotericism. My objection to that has always been that I think Strauss deflected attention away from philosophical arguments. I've read his introduction to the Penis translation, I don't know, maybe a dozen times. And I still can't figure out what Strauss thought Maimonides' actual philosophic contribution was. So anyway, I can't comment on everything that Philip and Len have accomplished. Therefore, let me focus on one issue where I think Len shows Maimonides at his philosophic best. And I'm referring to Maimonides' handling of the Scylla of occasionalism and the Charybdis of Aristotelianism. The occasionalism expounded in the Kalam held that God creates and then recreates every atom in the universe continually. If this is true, then strictly speaking, no atom exercises causal efficacy on any other. The only causal agent in the universe is God. It follows that any appearance of causality is nothing but constant conjunction between events and the belief that such conjunctions will repeat themselves in the future following God's will. For the same reason, the human will has no power to direct the actions of the body, As with the natural world, all we have is constant conjunction between willing something and moving our arms and legs. Again, all moral agency would defer to God. By referring everything to the will of God, this view not only undermines the possibility of natural science as we normally understand it, but the moral agency of human beings. As Len remarks, occasionalism left God no room for delegation of powers. End of quote. Against this, Maimonides argues that natural causation is real, and the Aristotelian account of the sublunar realm is valid. To take an example that Maimonides uses to discredit occasionalism, although it may be possible for an omnipotent God to endow elephants with the ability to fly, natural science shows this to be an absurdity. Okay. Aristotelianism represents the other side of the coin, which is to stay with natural science and extend it beyond the reach of the sublunar realm, where it holds true, to the heavenly realm. In other words, to hold that the same laws and principles that explain earthly phenomena also explain the origin of the universe and the movement of the heavenly bodies above. Here, too, I think Len is correct in saying Maimonides demurs. The causes and principles that explain the world as it is in its finished state do not necessarily apply to its genesis or creation. If change requires a transition from potency into act, as Aristotle says, there's no reason why creation has to follow the same sequence. Put otherwise, and to try to explain, change involves the movement from one existent state to another, that is, from hot to cold or from wet to dry, whereas creation involves going from nothing to something, and these are quite different. So as useful as Aristotelian science is in explaining change in the created order, there's no reason to trust it when it comes to explaining the origin of the created order. Thomas Aquinas famously says, creation is change only metaphorically. It's not real change. That brings us to the motion of the heavenly bodies. Strict adherence to scientific reasoning holds that the outermost sphere of the universe should impart motion to the next to the one under it, and so on down the line until we get to the sphere of the moon. At each transition point, the lower sphere should move either equal to the higher one or at the same speed. In no case should the lower sphere move faster than the one that imparts motion to it. Unfortunately, as Maimonides famously points out, we observe something quite different. The empirical evidence doesn't back this up. As he remarks, sometimes the swifter spheres are either above or below the lower ones. He concludes that Aristotelian science is valid for only that part of experience where we have close contact and direct observation of what we are studying. Once we get to the heavenly bodies, he says, we're dealing with things that are too far away and too high in rank to permit direct observation. In that case, what Aristotle has to say on the subject amounts to essentially guesswork or conjecture. Maimonides concludes that in Aristotle's celestial physics, no clear causes are given, no system emerges that can be called necessary. With his usual respect for Aristotle, Maimonides maintains that Aristotle himself must have recognized this. I used to think that Aristotle did not recognize this. The more I read of Aristotle, I think Maimonides may have a point, that Aristotle himself didn't think his arguments were entirely convincing. That's another subject for another conference. Okay. That leaves us. Okay. That leaves us with reason to believe that God created the universe in a unique act, that only God could produce and particularize the movements of the heavenly bodies according to divine will and divine wisdom. Let me repeat, because this is now going to be the problem. according to divine will and divine wisdom. That's going to be the problem. Problem is how to characterize the relation between will and wisdom in God. Are they identical, or does one follow upon the other? Will suggests choice and contingency, whereas wisdom suggests necessity. Here then is the crux of Maimonides' attempt to steer clear of the Scylla of occasionalism and the Charybdis of Aristotelianism. Can it be done? I'm not so sure. Although I have no doubt that this is what Maimonides wanted to do. He wanted to stay clear of the extreme, and I think Len is absolutely right for saying that was his intention. The question I'm raising is how successful was Maimonides in actually doing it? Maimonides' treatment of will and wisdom in God is pretty much what I think we would expect. When he wants to distance himself from Aristotle and argue that there are observable facts for which we have no scientific explanation, he talks as if the world is the product of divine will. 221, 313. On the other hand, when he wants to distance himself from occasionalism and defend the possibility of natural science, he talks as if the world is the product of divine wisdom. 325, 326. At 218, he claims that will is consequent on wisdom. At other places, he talks as if the difference between them is unimportant. We can look at things either way. I don't know how that works. Ultimately, I think he wants to say that God does not act on whim or caprice, so there are good reasons for God creating the world in a rational and understandable way. Fair enough. As it stands, the existence of good reason does not rule out contingency. The issue is whether I'll go slowly here. The issue is whether the reasons God had for creating the world are such that no alternative is logically possible, or whether alternatives are logically possible, but from God's perspective, not desirable. Okay, you want me to read that again? Whether no alternatives are logically possible to what God did, or whether alternatives are logically possible, but from God's perspective, not desirable. We saw that when it comes to the motion of the heavenly bodies, where science has no convincing explanation for what we observe, there's every reason to think that alternatives are logically possible. You could arrange the movement of the heavenly body. He seems to suggest quite differently. The question then is whether the appearance of alternatives, here we go. The question is whether the appearance of alternatives is due to the limits of our science, we just don't know enough, or whether God really could have made the heavenly bodies move in a completely different fashion if he had wanted to. At the bottom of this question is Maimonides' insistence on divine simplicity. And now we get into real trouble. Now comes the real trouble. In whatever way you view things, he insists, God cannot be composed of two or more notions or admit complexity or multiplicity in any sense whatsoever. On that point, there can be no compromise, no complexity of any kind in God. If God is radically simple in whatever way you view things, then I submit God's will and wisdom must be identical, because there is no complexity in God. If God's wisdom is what it is by necessity, then God's will must be what it is by necessity as well, because they're identical. Alternatively, if God's will is not governed by necessity, then God's wisdom could not be governed by necessity either, again, because they're identical. So this is a real issue. Granted that will and wisdom are separate faculties in us, no question about that. Maimonides would reply that there's no reason to think, in fact, every reason to deny, that their application to humans has any relevance to their application to God. The problem with this reply is that it offers an epistemological solution to what is at bottom really a metaphysical problem, God's simplicity. In a later age, Spinoza, I was introduced by a Spinoza scholar, was that right? In a later age, Spinoza took the identity of will and wisdom in God to imply universal determinism. If God's wisdom is perfect, this is Spinoza now. If God's wisdom is perfect, it cannot be other than what it is. If the divine will is identical with divine wisdom, then divine will cannot be other than what it is. In short, God's will and wisdom are both what they are by necessity for Spinoza. Anything that suggests God could have willed something different is due to our failure to understand the true causes behind things, Spinoza. Now comes Descartes. Descartes took exactly the opposite view. In contrast, Descartes took the identity of will and wisdom in God to imply radical contingency. God can will anything. If God had willed, for example, that the interior angles of a triangle not equal 180 degrees, as we know they do, then God's wisdom would have required this also. Although we can not understand how this could be true, there's no reason to think that our failure to understand something in any way restricts what God's power or what God can do. And here we're reminded of the Kalam contention that if God wanted elephants to fly, they'd be flying. God can do anything. In fact, Descartes says, who would be so bold as to say there's something God can't do, even changing the theorems of geometry? As I see it, the dispute between Descartes and Spinoza in the 17th century is a retelling of the dispute between the occasionalists and the Aristotelians. Again, I agree with Len that Maimonides wanted to avoid these extremes. Perhaps Maimonides, this is where I think what Maimonides, if I could psychoanalyze him for a minute, what Maimonides had in mind was probably something about what Leibniz referred to when he invoked reasons that incline without necessitating. They incline without, as I say, they're good reasons, but they aren't logically necessary. That's what I think Maimonides wanted. This means that while there may be logically possible alternatives to what God created, there were still good reasons for choosing the alternative that we now have. As Len writes, natural causes can bring about effects that are neither logically inevitable nor arbitrary expressions of divine caprice. That's the Len view, which I share really, is he wanted to avoid the two extremes. Reduced to simplest terms, the question before us is whether it makes sense for God to be the subject of a contingent proposition. I repeat, does it make sense for God to be the subject of a contingent proposition? Whether anything in God could be other than what it is. The usual response is to say that if God could do something differently, then God would no longer be perfect and therefore would surrender divine status. Unfortunately, this is not a question that Maimonides addresses explicitly. Maimonides is content to make two claims. One, what exists, including its causes and effects, could be different from what they are. I repeat, what exists, including its causes and effects, could be different from what they are, 313. Two, nothing in nature is futile or arbitrary, so that everything is ordered and perfectly arranged, 325. This is the basis of reasons that incline without necessitating. When it comes to the essence or inner nature of God, and that would be divine simplicity, what does divine simplicity really imply? Maimonides takes refuge in divine uniqueness and human fallibility. Again, I think he's substituting an epistemological answer for what is at root a metaphysical question. As far as he's concerned, both claims are defensible, the two claims I read, because they're supported by observation. Once we get beyond what we can observe and begin to speculate about the limits and possibilities of what God can do, we go beyond the reach of the human intellect. In short, I think Maimonides wants to stick with the view that some features of the universe exhibit necessity while others do not. As to how this duality can be reconciled with the identity of will and wisdom in God, he does not say, except to take refuge in the limits of human knowledge, which he does, as we know, repeatedly. I don't think, and here's the Strauss, the anti-esoterics. I don't think that Maimonides was hiding something or speaking to adherents of Judaism, the faithful, out of one side of his mouth and philosophers on the other. That's Strauss's. I just don't see that. I think he did his best to come to terms with one of the most pressing problems of his age, or for that matter, any age. That he did not solve the problem of how divine will and wisdom are related does nothing to diminish the important contributions he made. Thank you.
Well, sit right here so that I can take cue for the Q&A. If you want to raise your hand, I'll acknowledge you and write it down. Perfect.
Ask,
Yeah, okay.
why is the?
I said, you gotta go up there, they will continue on.
Okay,
Oops.
oh, there goes the speaker. Okay, so. That's fine, it's still operational. Yeah, Dr. Seeskin. I wanted to just ask, can the people online hear me? Okay, not sure. I wanted to ask why the distinction between will and wisdom isn't merely a virtual distinction, in the same manner that when the Bible describes, God being merciful, slow to anger, or wrathful, Maimonides sees that as unified in God while virtually distinct in humans.
So yeah, I mean, that's the problem. They have to be identical in God. The problem is that as we understand it, one is connected to necessity, one with contingency, and we have empirical evidence, some of which suggests necessity and some of which suggests contingency. So he's fighting a two-front war. That's getting in between one and the other. He's trying to establish a middle ground. But I don't see, well, let me back up. You can establish a middle ground if you want to say that will and wisdom are separate in God. That's fine. And then you have God wills some things, and no, that's the Leibniz position. God understood an infinite number of alternatives, and he willed one of an infinite number, but that separates them. Once you admit that will and wisdom are identical, I hope I got the thrust of your question here. Then we have to ask, are they both identical? Did they both collapse into will? Or did they both collapse into wisdom? And you get very different results, whichever one you pick. Maybe I've missed.
Yeah,
it,
just to
and I don't
clarify,
want-
what's the difficulty in saying that they're one in God, but they appear distinct to humans?
They appear distinct to human, but when we're talking about the universe, we have one set of data that suggests will is dominant, astronomy. And we have one set of data that suggests wisdom is dominant, namely the natural science of the subliminal realm. Now, I'm asking, is it possible for both of these data to, which is what we observe, but they seem to be at odds with one suggesting one thing, one suggesting another, and we can't resolve which one it is because we have to maintain their identity.
Do I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I got,
Me?
if you want to.
Whoever,
Yeah,
I'm
Well,
open.
is that, the only follow-up is like, what's the distinction between that difficulty and also the difficulty of describing God on one hand as wrathful and on the other hand slow to anger? Where, Maimonides, as we all know, resolves that by saying
Yeah,
it's
he
distinct
does it,
from
but
the
that's easier to do. Because that's dealing not with God, but with God's consequences or effects. And he's clear that something that is simple can have multiple consequences or effects depending on the medium through which it acts.
But
So, for example, I'll use this example: a flame. The flame is one thing, okay, but it softens clay and it hardens it hardens clay and it softens sugar. So once you're dealing with the effects or consequences, then you can have plurality. And then there's no problem. But when you're dealing with the thing itself, you're stuck with absolute identity.
But we're only observing that through effects, right? Observing it through the effects of astronomy.
Right. So what you just have to say is, I think what he does say is, in the end, this is a problem with the limits of human knowledge and trying to penetrate into the essence of God, which it cannot do. Now, is that a satisfactory answer? I'm not so sure. I thought, by the way, that was not a satisfactory answer.
Let me try and take a stab at it, and I can't call it more than a stab at it because you've proposed a serious problem. It might be a dilemma. We know that Maimonides thought you had good evidence for the will of God, which was not reducible to an Aristotelian cosmological explanation in the placement of the stars in the heavens. He gives that example because as far as Aristotelian science is concerned, he raises the challenge. They can't explain why the stars are placed the way they are. To us, it looks arbitrary. People today might say it's a matter of chance or whatever. I think that Micah is right to look at the limits of our knowledge, and that the idea of God's will and wisdom being one is a proposition that follows from the theological idea of necessity about God that Maimonides endorses, and the absolute unity of God that he endorses. And Maimonides does think that what we understand, we attribute to God's wisdom. And what we fail to understand, we might call chance or something like that, but well, ultimately we attribute it to God's will.
Right.
In the case of, if it were a Christian, they would start talking about grace and who's chosen and so forth. That's not an issue for Maimonides. But the matter of creation, why the world has existed for the length of time that it has, and not always or not from a different time, That's an area where he thinks that we need to refer to God's will. He thinks that will and wisdom are the same in God, and I agree with both of you that he thinks that from our limited standpoint as finite minds, we don't see the absoluteness of that unity. In that respect, I see an affinity to the Spinoza solution, where differences are subjective and relative in that term, looked at under the microscope of absolute unity. These differences are.
Spinoza, contingency is just another.
I'm not talking about contingency. I'm talking about will and wisdom specifically. I think the idea that those two psychological descriptions of God represent human ways of accommodating to a reality which is beyond our understanding. And in this sense, I think I agree with you that Maimonides is going to draw a line and say we don't know how really. I do think that there's room for some dynamic there in the sense that the more we know, if we know the laws of cosmology, we might know why the stars are located where they are, and without having to refer to an arbitrary will on God's in placing them in different positions. Whether that means that he has resolved everything into absolute unity and determinism, I don't think that would follow, because he would still be able to say that that God's wisdom is influenced by what he thinks is best, by what he thinks is good. I think he has a virtual way of reconciling this apparent contradiction, but I don't think that he thinks that we have the capacity to go there. I'm glad it's fair enough. I don't think it's absolute. I'd like to defer to my colleague Emma, who knows how Spinoza in a way echoes that idea by making the attributes of God distinct more in our limited understanding than they are in and of themselves. Can you contribute to that?
Yeah.
Emma?
I mean, I think that the triangle that you illustrated with the card, Spinoza, and Leibniz is very, very on point, and it makes absolute sense. I think that Spinoza doesn't have, I mean, his understanding of infinity is so radical, right, that he cannot fathom anything necessitating God, but God's own essence.
Right.
And God's own essence being composed, he says constituted by his attributes. It means that
As understood by reason, which he prays, they get things right.
I mean, we have to, right? It's adequate knowledge. So as you were saying, he calls it will and intellect, but they must be identical. And he says, in fact, if they were any different, you'd be denying either omniscience or omnipotence. And so you would be attacking and denigrating God. Because in one case, God can create everything that we can think, or in the other, he can't know everything that he can do. So in either case, you're messing with God, which is never really just ask the
but unlike Maimonides, Spinoza's things, you know exactly what God. There's no mystery. God is either an infinite system of ideas arranged in perfect order, or an infinite system of physical objects arranged in that. Everyone knows.
You can have failed to know.
We cannot do it.
Yeah,
But
that's
somehow these things agree.
right.
For Maimonides, these things somehow agree. And in order to know how they agree, you would need to know a lot more about cosmos and a lot more about God than we possibly know.
So this is the question I wanted to ask earlier, is that, okay, the Spinoza system is impossible, but the Maimonidean system, could there even potentially be an event that in which there's a contradiction between God's will and wisdom? In other words, could God, let's say, will something that is contrary to his wisdom, but nonetheless will it for some other purpose? And that,
Yeah, I don't see, well, you say, I don't see how Maimonides could say it, but I'm pretty clear that the Torah does say it. The Torah has God regretting things. So
That's
the Torah has God, creating human beings and then looking down and saying, oh, what a mess. I'm really sorry I did that. I didn't know what I was doing. But that's not Maimonides.
No, to be fair, that's something that Maimonides will resolve as a matter of poetry.
Right.
It's not that God literally regretted creating human beings.
Right.
It's
Not Maimonides.
that's a way of saying that what human beings were doing was incompatible with what they were supposed to do, not incompatible with what God expected.
well, then, ask me maybe a better example be the reverse, which is mercy. Something like divine mercy, could that be an instance possible in which a divine wisdom would in theory dictate a certain outcome, but divine will has mitigated the circumstance?
But that you can think of God as a judge sitting up in court and listening to a pleas of mercy. But for him, mercy is an attribute of action, and it just describes the way the world was created. Namely, every creature in the world has sufficient opportunity to seek food, reproduce itself, and defend itself. That's God's mercy. It's not the way we normally think of it in judicial.
I was just gonna ask if something like what Jake did is gesturing towards an instance in which it could seem as if God's will is overriding God's reason. Could that be something like how Maimonides understands miracles? And that, of course, for Maimonides, miracles are not, in point of fact, eruptions of the divine will that instructs the natural order of things. The splitting of the sea is not God deciding on a way to split the sea, but the accumulation of multiple natural factors that occur at just the right moment. But from the perspective of a human observer, it does sort of seem like God is overriding the perfect harmony and beauty of God's nature. So is that
It is just, in other words, they're baked into the cake.
right? But from the perception of
state, the 6 things created in the twilight.
Right.
Then it's created in the twilight of day.
but you have to resort to that explanation because it seems like to us it's sort of
Looks like a disruption for God's sake. I mean,
right.
was.
I think what Dr. Seeskin was implying is that this solution is not fully satisfying for you because it's an epistemic band-aid on a metaphysical practice.
Fair enough. We have other points that people want to raise. I should do.
Well, it's your right, sir. I said with the pleasure of.
Problems in charge here. It's basically the case. Do other people want to speak? That was a good exchange. And we've got about 4 minutes to stand up, stretch our legs, set up a big stretch, and open up for our next speaker.